There are many people who get upset that there are people in the world who are enormously wealthy, especially when we see so many people who are living in poverty. And that leads to the question, is wealth immoral? Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Calvin Beisner. He is the national spokesperson for the Cornwall Alliance and also the author of the article, A Sad Tale of a Wealthy Millennial's Moral Confusion. And I really encourage viewers to read this. Cornwallalliance.org is where you can connect with this article. Cal, welcome to Bridge City News once again.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be back with you.
Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I mean, I think we all wrestle with how to steward the relative wealth we enjoy here in the Western world, and we can feel guilty when we see how much we have compared to those in less developed nations. I mean, Cal, your story starts with a young woman who is telling her mother how guilty she felt for being able to go out for dinner, and her mom, living in Africa, was struggling to make ends meet, right?
Yeah, that's the case. And this young lady, after having gone out with friends to dinner in Chicago, she had immigrated from South Africa to the United States, and she called her mother on the phone at some point. Her mother's still in South Africa, and she told her mother how guilty she felt. And to her surprise, her mother responded with a rather stinging rebuke. She said, "How dare you spit in God's face?" Her mother was urging her, don't feel guilty for the wealth that you enjoy there. Instead, count it as a blessing from God and then use it to benefit others, including, of course, she ought to use it to benefit her mother. She should care for her mother. But there's nothing wrong with having wealth. And when one has it, one should treat it as a blessing from God, but something that is entrusted to one to serve others as well.
Hmm. Now, you kind of wrote this article in response to another article by a man named Adam Roberts. He's a millennial who wrote his article for Vox, and it was entitled, Is Wealth Immoral? I understand he felt guilty for having inherited over $1 million, wealthy parents. Can you share some of his story?
Well, he explains that his parents and his grandparents built their wealth through investments in the oil industry and in banking and in some companies that produced equipment for the military. And he felt like there was something wrong with all three of those, something immoral about all of those. But he also just simply felt like there was something wrong with any economic system, any society in which individuals could amass great amounts of wealth. And so he felt like there ought to be something done to just make it impossible for any individual to accumulate millions or billions of dollars. He'd inherited about 1.2 million. And he said that as he compared himself with many others around him who really were in need, he felt like it was very important for him to give away much of what he had. He had by this time given away about a third of what he had inherited, and he intended to give away the rest. Now, I actually admire his compassion, I admire his care for the poor, and I admire his decision to give away what he had. But that decision should have been based really not on a sense of guilt about what he had, but instead on a decision to help those who were in need. And he ought to recognize that he's in a position to help them precisely because he did have that wealth. If he didn't have it, he couldn't have helped them.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to give something away that you don't have, for sure. Now, he felt that a system that allows people to amass, that kind of wealth while others struggle is immoral. That's interesting. He's somehow thinking that's wrong. But as you point out, then how do people actually get enough money to share with other people?
Yeah, one of the most basic rules about how to help the poor is don't be one of them. If you are poor yourself, you can't do much to help the other poor. Doesn't mean you can't do anything, but you can do much more if you're not. And as he tries to say, look, we need a system that would just make it impossible for individuals to amass great amounts of wealth. Well, what kind of a system does that? It can only be a system that can take away what people earn for themselves. That's a position that violates private property rights, that refuses to reward people for their hard work, for their careful preparation for careers. And when you refuse to reward people for their efforts, well, those efforts pretty quickly disappear. If he thinks that it's a good thing for people to produce some wealth by being medical doctors, but not by being in the oil industry, not only is that a short-sighted judgment in terms of the oil industry, because tremendous benefits have come from it, but also he fails to recognize that if you're not going to reward people handsomely for making all the sacrifices necessary, financial sacrifices, uh, years and years of very, very diligent study, self-denial. If you won't reward people for that, you won't get many people doing it. And that means that we will go without good doctors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think people, again, as you point out, really mean well. They want to help, but they haven't thought it through logically how this will work, to redistributing wealth just, randomly here or piece by piece. Many people feel that it's immoral to have what they call excessive, wealth. But again, ponder that for a moment. How do we define excessive? Now, King Solomon was perhaps the wealthiest man on earth ever, but interestingly, that wasn't his downfall, I don't think. He's not criticized for that, biblically speaking, I don't think.
Right. Indeed, many of the most important characters in biblical history were wealthy people. Job, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, uh, David, Solomon, Joseph of Arimathea in the New Testament, who provided his grave for Jesus, was described as a wealthy man. Wealthy women provided food and shelter for Jesus and the disciples as they went about in their itinerant ministry. Lydia in the early church was a seller of purple, we're told in the book of Acts. Well, purple was a thing that was used only by the very wealthy. Lydia was herself probably a very wealthy woman. The Apostle Paul benefited from her provision. Wealth is not a problem. When we idolize it, when we begin to treat it as if it's our God, when we act as if our ownership of it were absolute, instead of a stewardship under God in which he entrusts wealth to us to serve other people, that's when we abuse wealth. But it's not the wealth itself that's wrong, it's our own hearts.
I think the definition of excessive wealth, if we're honest, we probably look at ourselves in the mirror, is anybody who has more money than me. That's excessive. There's something wrong with that, right? We need to rethink that. So, you pointed out earlier, this individual, Adam Roberts, writing the article, you know, he's wrestling with this wealth here and how it was actually accumulated. Does it matter how you gain it? Now, again, he had mentioned, some oil, maybe some military spending and so forth, as compared to maybe getting rich, being a doctor, which is maybe more benevolent and that sort of thing. But is that really an issue?
So you might think, anyway. And yeah, think about this. Doctors use hundreds of different medications and hundreds of different pieces of equipment that are derived from oil. Oil that's brought out of the ground in order to produce fuel for our cars, our trucks, our buses, our ships, our airplanes, and so on, which itself does wonderful things, transporting goods and people and services and people all over the world. That's all good. But also there are thousands of byproducts from oil. Doctors wouldn't be able to get much done if it weren't for the fact that we make those byproducts from oil, and we wouldn't be bringing up the oil, drilling it, if those were the only thing that we could do with it, because in fact, those don't bring enough profit to oil companies to make it worth their going to the trillions of dollars worth of investment necessary to get that oil. So if we want the privileges, if we want the blessings, the benefits of medicine, we need to want oil. And similarly for coal and natural gas, other fossil fuels, these are the most abundant, affordable, reliable sources of energy available to us, with the possible exception of nuclear. But unfortunately, a lot of environmentalists hate nuclear, even though it's got a better safety record than anything else. And frankly, abundant, affordable, reliable energy is indispensable to lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty. So if Adam Roberts really cares about the poor, he should want them to be able to benefit from fossil fuels because
Yeah.
those are what have lifted billions out of poverty and can lift billions more.
Interesting perspective, yeah. Now, I think what we're seeing coming out of this kind of mindset, and we're seeing more and more of this worldview spreading, but organizations and political parties, they're enacting policies that are precisely aimed at preventing individuals from becoming super wealthy and powerful. Some see that as a good thing, but is it necessarily?
Boy, if you look at the history of socialism, and I don't mean, a welfare state. A welfare state is not the same thing as socialism. Socialism is insisting that the state must either own or at least control the major means of production in your economy. Uh, Basically, it's a denial of private property when it comes to productive property. If you look at the history of socialism, what you see is a history of poverty and a history of extreme oppression. The reason for the one, poverty, is that socialism really doesn't reward people for their unusually great efforts. And if you're not going to be rewarded, a lot of people just won't make those extra efforts. But the reason for the oppression is that, frankly, most people are not real happy about having their property taken away from them and given to somebody else. And they will resist if they're able. And so I try to help people to recognize that socialism is the violent means of exchange, and the free market or capitalism is the peaceful means of exchange. If I want something that you have, the only way I can get it from you in a free market is to offer you something that you want more than what you already have. And the only way you can get me to give you that is to offer me something that I want more than what I already have. So the exchange will take place only voluntarily in a peaceful relationship between the two of us. But in socialism, if I want something you have and you're not willing to give it to me, well, I can vote for somebody who will go to Parliament or Congress and pass a law that requires you to give that to me. And then if you resist, you're now a lawbreaker. And what happens to lawbreakers? They get arrested, they get tried, they get convicted, they get put in prison, or if they resist, they can be shot. This is the record of socialism with well over 100 million people killed by their own governments in socialist or communist
Yeah, yeah, we
countries.
don't want to see that starting up again for sure. And if somebody really believes in wealth distribution to make the world a more just, equitable place, I mean, if their own lives should start to reflect that. Any thoughts on what that would actually look like then? And
Well, certainly they ought to be giving generously, and that's what we as Christians are called to do. The early church is described in the book of Acts as a church in which uh, nobody thought of his possessions as belonging only to him. People thought of their possessions as given to them by God to use for the service of their brothers and sisters in Christ, the needy in their communities. And for that reason, they were selling property and giving the proceeds to help the poor around them, so that Luke could tell us in Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4 that there were no needy among them because the needs were being met by this generous charitable giving. But it wasn't a matter of justice. It was a matter of charity, and it reflected the giving of God to us, of Christ himself. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 8 that he, Christ, who was rich, became poor for our sakes, that we through him might become rich.
mm,
This is the gospel. And unfortunately, what happens with the social justice movement is that justice gets confused with grace. God ordained the church to dispense grace. He ordained the state to dispense justice. And justice means rendering to people what they are due, what they deserve, what they've earned. Whereas grace means rendering great benefits where in fact we are due the exact opposite. So the gospel tells us that we're justified by grace through faith in Christ, not by earning our justification. And when you confuse justice and grace, you ultimately you corrupt the gospel and you lose it.
I appreciate you sharing that perspective. We need to hear that. And you point out that this victim mindset, I think it's something like that, a victim mindset. It encourages envy, resentment toward those who God has blessed, and also some false guilt on the part of those who are blessed, right? So brief final thoughts on how we should view wealth?
Well, what we should do is to recognize that it is a gift from God, and it is something for which it's perfectly okay for us to work for it. We mustn't make it our own God. We mustn't idolize it, right? We have to subdue that temptation. But there's nothing immoral about having wealth, and we need to use it well. The whole issue of social justice, the resentment of the rich, the idea that we have to have state enforced redistribution of wealth, I've addressed that in a booklet called Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. And actually, if any of your viewers go to cornwallalliance.org and click on the donate button and make a donation of any size, no matter how small, and ask for social justice, we'll be glad to send it to them. And if they're in the US anyway, their gift will be 100% tax deductible.
Right. Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Cal, for sharing your perspective with us here today.
Well, thank you very much, too, and God bless.
Dr. Calvin Beisner, he is the national spokesperson for the Cornwall Alliance and author of the article, A Sad Tale of a Wealthy Millennial's Moral Confusion. It's really worth the read. You can do that online at cornwallalliance.org. On behalf of all of us at Bridge City News, thank you so much for watching today.